Hello and welcome back. We have been discussing the paper Epistemology, which has been introduced newly for the UGC NECF in our sixth semester for University of Delhi Honours students, and that is the core DSC 18. To continue with, today we would be discussing yet another significant topic which has been written by the very famous Johnathan Barnes, entitled On Epistēmē. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, this article, which is also there in our secondary readings, we find that Epistēmē, the article written by Johnathan Barnes, examines Plato's knowledge vocabulary, particularly the verbs where it has been used by Plato and their corresponding nouns. This article rejects the imposition of modern epistemic categories such as knowledge that, knowledge how, and knowledge by acquaintance onto Plato's work, and instead argues for a structural linguistic approach to understanding his epistemology. Now, before we proceed on to understanding or to learn about this article, Epistēmē, there are certain epistemic terms that needs clarification, and that's what we are going to do now. The Greek epistemic terms gnosis, epistēmē, and techne can be translated loosely into English as gnosis may be something to do with knowledge, understanding, insight. Epistēmē, on the other hand, to do with something which is, say, structured or systematic knowledge, or science and maybe even theoretical understanding. Techne, on the other hand, connotes something which is to do with skill, craft, applied knowledge, art. So we would see that these terms gnosis, epistēmē, and techne would be recurring in Barnes' article. Now, epistemology. What precisely is this again? Please understand, we are dealing with Johnathan Barnes' paper, and Johnathan Barnes, as we know, is a classical Greek scholar. So, but natural, we are tracing it from Plato's work here. Now, epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, explores the nature, sources, limits, and justification of knowledge, which we know by now, and the three Greek terms that reflect different dimensions of epistemic inquiry, forming a tripartite model that corresponds to various aspects of epistemological debates. Now, to begin with, first, when you talk about gnosis, let's talk about the experiential and conceptual knowledge. Gnosis refers to personal insight, awareness, or understanding of something. It often connotes direct, experiential knowledge, sometimes associated with mystical or intuitive understanding in Platonic and Gnostic traditions. In epistemology, it corresponds to knowledge by acquaintance, Russell, for instance, or intuitive knowledge, Spinoza. It can also be linked to phenomenology, where direct experiences forms the basis of knowledge. Now, the second term in this article that keeps repeating a number of times is epistēmē. Epistēmē is the systematic, propositional knowledge. We can also reflect about epistēmē as something which represents structured, theoretical knowledge akin to scientific knowledge. Plato and Aristotle considered epistēmē as knowledge based on rational principles and logical justification. In epistemology, it closely aligns with knowledge that, which is the propositional knowledge. Descartes and Kant emphasized episteme as certain, justified knowledge. It influences a modern scientific realism where knowledge is derived from systematic inquiry. Now, coming to the third term of this paper is techne, which again basically means practical or skill-based knowledge. Techne refers to practical know-how associated with craft, skill, and expertise. Aristotle contrasts techne with episteme, where techne applies knowledge for productive purposes. In epistemology, we see that it corresponds to knowledge how. If the former corresponded to knowledge that, here it is corresponding to knowledge how. And Gilbert Ryle, the meaning, the ability to perform tasks skillfully, has been someone who had worked on this extensively. Foundational in pragmatism, Dewey, for example, where knowledge is not merely abstract but action-oriented. Important in philosophy of AI, where skill-based knowledge is simulated through machine learning. So we see that these Greek terms offer a more nuanced framework for discussing different forms of knowledge. Modern epistemology often reduces knowledge to propositional knowledge, episteme, but gnosis and techne highlight dimensions of knowledge that include experiential insight and practical skill. Understanding epistemology through these Greek distinctions allow for a richer exploration of knowledge in philosophy, science, and technology. Just as a footnote, I would also like to put in here that these three, or the tripartite distinction of episteme in Johnathan Barnes' article is important, for we see a similar pattern also in Indian philosophy. In our Indian epistemology, it is just not about jnana. It is also, please understand, the sources of knowledge. Besides being Shruti, Smriti, there is also Nididhyasana. So knowledge, yes, it is through Shruti, that is whatever we hear via our hearing capacity. Smriti, memory. Nididhyasana, however, is the applicability. And this part of Nididhyasana, if it isn't complete, the Indian epistemology too breaks down. And thus, the techne part, or the skill part, or the art part, or the craft part, or the applicability part of episteme in the West comes very close to our Indian epistemology. Nevertheless, let's proceed further. The Greek epistemic verbs noesis, edenia, and epistastia can be translated into English as gignoskian, which is to perceive, to recognize, to come to know. Edine, to know factually, to be aware of, to have knowledge of. Epistastei, to understand thoroughly, to have mastery over, to be skilled in. Now, epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, concerns itself with how we acquire, justify, and define knowledge. These Greek verbs offer distinct perspectives on how knowledge is formed, possessed, and applied, corresponding to different epistemological theories. The first, which is, I'm just going to spell it out, Gignoskian, O with a dash, which is gignoskian, is knowledge through recognition and experience. This verb signifies learning through experience, perception, or recognition, the process of coming to know something. Plato and Aristotle often used it to indicate knowledge gained through perception or acquaintance. In epistemology, it corresponds to knowledge by acquaintance, for example, Bertrand Russell, where knowing something means having direct experiential contact with it. It relates to empiricism, which emphasizes experience as the foundation of knowledge, like John Locke, David Hume. Then the second is Eidenai, which is Eidenai, which is propositional or declarative knowledge. This verb expresses knowing facts, possessing explicit propositional knowledge. For example, I know that the earth orbits the sun. Plato associates this with true knowledge, particularly when linked to his idea of forms or idea. In epistemology, it closely aligns with knowledge that, meaning propositional or factual knowledge, central to rationalism. And when we talk about rationalism, Descartes and Kant comes to the picture, where knowledge is based on logical reasoning and innate ideas. It forms the basis of scientific and mathematical knowledge, where statements can be tested and justified. The last, which is the epistēmē, E-P-I-S-T-E-S-T-H-A-I, is the mastery or expertise and know-how. This verb conveys a deeper, systematic understanding of a subject, not just knowing a fact, but grasping its core, its principles. It often implies expertise or mastery over a field, distinguishing it from mere opinion or surface level knowledge. So we see that this corresponds to knowledge how, meaning practical, skill-based knowledge. It is closely related to Aristotle's concept of epistēmē, which he defined as true, justified knowledge grounded in first principles. It is relevant to virtue epistemology, where knowledge is seen as an intellectual virtue that must be cultivated. So, the three Greek epistemic verbs we can say, as you can see in the slide here, represents different dimensions of knowing, as already mentioned. The first, gignoschein, which relates to learning through experience or knowledge by acquaintance. Second, Eidenai, which refers to knowing facts and propositions, propositional knowledge. And the last, epistēmē, which signifies deep understanding and mastery, knowledge of how or expertise. So, understanding these distinctions within epistemology broadens our perspective beyond the modern Western focus on propositional knowledge, incorporating experiential, practical and systematic ways of knowing, an approach that remains relevant in contemporary debates on AI, education and cognitive science. Now, the central thesis is of this entire article of Johnathan Barnes' Epistēmē is that Plato's epistemic terms functions as an interconnected system rather than as isolated concepts. The study refutes the assumption that gignoschein aligns strictly with knowledge by acquaintance, epistēmē with knowledge how, and Eidenai with knowledge that. Instead, Plato's Greek epistemology does not fit neatly into these distinctions, and meaning must be derived contextually rather than through direct translation. This is important, which I am repeating again, that this entire gamut of the tripartite section that we have discussed, Barnes claims that Plato's Greek epistemology does not fit neatly into these distinctions, and meaning must be derived contextually rather than through direct translation. Furthermore, the paper traces the historical evolution of epistemic distinctions from Ryle's influence on classical scholarship in the mid-20th century to Land's 1963 structuralist analysis of Plato's epistemic vocabulary. It demonstrates how subsequent interpretations, particularly Land's 1981 revision, attempted to reintroduce epistemic troika-like categories but ultimately failed to capture the fluidity of Plato's knowledge terms. Now, if we are to look at the critical review of this article of Johnathan Barnes, Epistēmē, we see that the strengths of this article are that it rejects oversimplification. The study avoids the common mistake of applying modern epistemological distinctions to ancient texts. By deconstructing the epistemic troika, it presents a more nuanced understanding of Plato's knowledge terms. Linguistic rigor is yet the other strength of this article. The structuralist approach provides a methodological breakthrough emphasizing semantic relationships over isolated definitions. This is a major contribution to both classical studies and philosophy of language. However, the paper or the article also has its fair share of challenges. It challenges established theories. The article refutes Lawrence's later attempted 1981 to categorize Greek knowledge verbs within the epistemic troika and instead supports his original 1963 structuralist findings, which highlight the complexity and fluidity of Plato's vocabulary. The cross-linguistic insight. By comparing Greek knowledge verbs with French or German or Latin and Russian equivalents, the study demonstrates that epistemic distinctions are language-specific rather than universal. It also engages with historical debates, and in this article it provides a detailed historical account of 20th century debates on Platonic epistemology, tracing Ryle's influence on epistemic categorization and its eventual critique by Lyons and others. Now let's talk about the weaknesses of this article. 1. Over-reliance on structural semantics. While the linguistic approach is valuable, it may downplay the role of philosophical argumentation in shaping meaning. Plato was not merely a linguist analyzing word relationships. He was a philosopher constructing an epistemic framework. A more balanced approach would consider both linguistic and philosophical dimensions. Limited engagement with alternative linguistic theories. This article relies primarily on structural semantics but does not fully engage with alternative linguistic approaches such as cognitive linguistics or pragmatics, which might offer different insights into meaning formation. Also, this article neglects philosophical implications beyond language. While the article successfully demonstrates that Plato's knowledge terms do not map onto modern epistemic categories, it does not sufficiently address how this affects our understanding of Platonic epistemology. If Plato's knowledge concepts are more fluid, what does this imply for his theory of forms, dialectic, and epistemic justification? Further, insufficient engagement with later philosophical traditions. The study focuses almost exclusively on Plato, with minimal engagement with how Aristotle or later philosophers interpreted these knowledge terms. Since Aristotle redefined episteme in a more rigid sense, it would be useful to explore whether his reinterpretation supports or contradicts the article's thesis. Now let's talk about the methodological rigor of this article, the reliability of the findings. The article's methodological rigor ensures a high degree of reliability. The corpus analysis of Platonic texts provide strong empirical support for the claim that Plato's knowledge terms do not fit modern categories. However, semantic analysis always involves some level of interpretation, and alternative linguistic frameworks could yield different results. So the question then further is, are the conclusions supported by the data that is found in Johnathan Barnes' article Epistēmē? Yes. The conclusions are largely supported by the data. The quantitative analysis of knowledge verbs in Plato's dialogues confirms that. For in Gignoskin, it frequently appears with both propositional and acquaintance-related contexts, contradicting the idea that it represents knowledge by acquaintance. Epistēmē is not strongly linked to propositional knowledge, undermining claims that it aligns with knowledge that, and epistēstai is used interchangeably with both Gignoskin and Epistēmē, making it inappropriate to treat it as exclusively propositional. However, some conclusions depend on interpretive choices rather than strict data analysis, and the claim that epistēstai lacks a core meaning remains controversial and could be debated further. Now, the limitations mentioned by the author Johnathan Barnes himself has been about translation constraints. Barnes does mention that the direct translations of Greek epistemic terms fail to capture their full semantic range. Contextual variability is yet another limitations and possible biases by the author, where different dialogues use these terms in subtly different ways, making it difficult to derive fixed definitions. Exclusively Platonic focus. Now, the study does not examine how Aristotle, the Stoics, or later philosophers interpreted these knowledge terms. Potential biases, structural bias. The article assumes that meaning is primarily determined by linguistic structure, potentially understanding philosophical and historical influences. Anti-troika assumption. The study starts from the premise that the epistemic troika is misleading, which might bias the analysis towards finding evidence against it. The study complicates modern epistemic distinctions, suggesting that knowledge how, and knowledge by acquaintance may be language-specific rather than universal categories. Plato's fluid use of knowledge terms indicates that epistemic concepts may be more interconnected than previously thought. So then, what is the implications for translation studies? These findings highlight the dangers of translating philosophical concepts too rigidly, emphasizing the need for context-sensitive interpretation. Implications for linguistics and AI. The study's structuralist methodology could inform computational linguistic models, improving AI-driven translations of ancient texts. Now, what is the future research directions? Expanding to Aristotle and later philosophers. So, how did Aristotle's stricter definition of epistēmē affect later philosophical interpretations? Did Stoic or Neoplatonic philosophers adopt a more rigid or fluid epistemic framework? So, when we explore the alternative linguistic models, we also have questions like, could cognitive linguistics or discourse analysis offer additional insights into Plato's epistemic vocabulary? And if we are applying computational linguistics, then the question that is, could machine learning algorithms analyze shifts in meaning across different classical texts? So this article fundamentally challenges how we interpret Plato's knowledge vocabulary, rejecting modern epistemic categories in favor of a structuralist linguistic approach. While its linguistic rigor is impressive, a broader philosophical engagement with Plato's epistemology and later traditions would strengthen its conclusions. Nonetheless, the study opens new avenues for interdisciplinary research, influencing philosophy, linguistics, and AI-driven text analysis. In our next class, we will be summarizing the key aspects of this paper. Thank you so much.